In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row upon row. Hi, I'm Robin Scott-Elliot, welcome to Time Tunnellers, and today I'm going to talk to you about remembering and Remembrance Day and how the whole idea that we follow today came about. So those lines were taken from a poem by a Canadian called John McCrae, who himself died during the First World War. But this idea that he came up with of the poppies that grew all over the north of France and Belgium, coming up between the graves, that's what captured people's ideas, and they came up with the thought of having poppies to commemorate the fallen during the First World War. So Remembrance Day is always marked on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So that's 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, because it was on that day in 1918 that the war ended. And people began to think about how we should best commemorate and remember the people who had died during the war. So let me take you back to 1916. So this is during the war. And there was an army chaplain, a young army chaplain called David Railton. And he was walking down a narrow lane behind the lines through a ruined village. And he came across his one single wooden cross. And on it was carved an unknown soldier for the Black Watch. Because this World War was so unlike everything that's seen before, with its huge guns and artillery and mass slaughter, that lots of young men were killed and they were never identified. So they were buried in mass graves or buried in graves, and it would just say on them, "To an unknown soldier." Now this really struck in David Railton's head, and after the war he began to write to people saying, "I have got this idea for how we can commemorate those who died during the war." And eventually by 1920 he managed to persuade the powers that be, the King and the Prime Minister and the Dean of Westminster Abbey, that this was a really good idea to commemorate all the fallen, how it could bring us all together through one person. So on the 9th November 1920, 6 bodies were dug up from battlefields across France and Belgium, 6 bodies of young men who were unidentified, and their coffins were all brought to one room in France. And this general walked along the line and then just pointed to one coffin, and that coffin became the unknown soldier. So it was taken to the coast, put aboard a battleship called HMS Verdun, and on the 10th of November sailed back to England. From there it was taken by a special train up to Westminster Abbey, where on the 11th of November the coffin was interred into the ground in Westminster Abbey. So this means that the unknown soldier is lying alongside kings and princes and prime ministers and all the famous people of our country, like great writers like Charles Dickens is buried in Westminster Abbey. And the idea is that we have this single soldier who no one knows who he is, and he lies there on equal terms with kings and prime minister, because he represents all the soldiers who died during the First World War. So the idea is, in this coffin is the body of a young man who could be British, he could be English, he could be Scottish, but he also might be Indian, he might be African, he might be Canadian, he might be Australian, he might be New Zealand, from any of the parts of what was then the British Empire, who had to come to France and fight in this terrible, terrible war. So he represents all of us, and it's through that people could remember all those young men who had died in France and elsewhere around the world. Because the First World War was like no war that had been seen before then. 880,000, more than 880,000 British and Empire soldiers were killed during the war. In fact, my great-granddad's brother, Charlie, was one of all 4 of the brothers died during the war, and he was fighting alongside Indian soldiers. He was killed and his body was never found. So in theory, he could be the unknown soldier, and there'll be loads of you who will have relatives who would have fought and would have died in the First World War, and if they were buried in unknown graves, any of them could be the unknown soldier. So it still links all of us today to that person who lies in the grave in Westminster Abbey. He represents all the young people who died during the war. So I'm not going to set you a writing task. I'm just going to ask you, during this week of remembrance, when we think about the people who've died, I want you just to spare a thought for that young man who lies in that grave, and just think, imagine who he might have been. He might have been a farmer from India, he might have been a sailor from Australia, a fisherman from the Hebrides, a clerk from London. He could have been almost anyone, and he represents a bit of all of us. So just spare him and all the others who fought and died in wars thought on the 11th of November. Thank you.